All right, well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today or this afternoon. My name is Amber Green. I'm an assistant or associate professor of special education at the University of Texas at Arlington. I am joined with my exemplar presenters and colleagues, Dr. Enfield, who's the superintendent of Highline Public Schools, and Holly Ferguson, who is over data and accountability as well in Highline Public Schools in Washington State. Today, you are joining a presentation titled PBIS in Theory and Policy, and we'll be talking about the development and implementation of disciplinary policies and procedures. As you have experience, I'm sure, throughout this forum, there are virtual forum expectations, and they are the same in this meeting as they have been in other meetings. So if you would just refresh yourself with the expectations of being responsible, respectful, and safe during our presentation, we would appreciate it. Also, hopefully you have, if you found your way to our presentation, you have found your way to other presentations. And so you would just look at your personalized schedule through your agenda. If you need to switch back and forth between sessions, you can navigate the session page. Again, looking at the session details, you select to join session, and then you interact through the chat, polls, and uploaded files. We will be using the chat feature for our presentation. So if you'll just familiarize yourself with that platform as well. And we do not have any polls there, but we do have the PowerPoint is uploaded in the files, as well as some other supporting resources and documents for you there. So please familiarize yourself with those resources. And be careful of accidentally navigating away. So just make sure, again, that you are in the correct session. You click anywhere on the navigation menu or on a person's name, you may end up navigating away. So just be careful where you click on the page. And again, support is available and using the help desk kind of feature or button, and you will be able to receive help. So we will go ahead and get started. I'm going to lead us off with our presentation, and we'll talk about an overview of policy and theory around policy. Let's start with our outcomes though. The outcome for this session is that we will discuss best practices for policy revision and implementation that can increase equitable and preventative school frameworks. Our agenda for today are more like the outline for this presentation is we will split the presentation between thinking about PBIS, the PBIS framework in theory, and then we'll move into the PBIS framework in policy. The Highline Public Schools, my exemplars, will support us in looking at some examples of how they have implemented policy practices in their framework. Also, I want to just mention that using the Pathable chat, we will take your questions. So we want this to be more of a discussion-centered format. So we will take your questions. I will relay your questions to Susan and Holly during the presentation, because I'm sure you'll likely have some questions about how they done such a wonderful job in their district and got the data that you will be provided with. So we welcome and encourage your questions in the chat. A brief history of discipline policies can be found over the last 100 years. Thinking about the Safe School study, where that study found that while school violence decreased compared to previous years, school crime increased when the rules or policies or procedures were not clear or when they were extremely punitive. This Safe School study was the catalyst of providing a larger shift, or the largest shift, towards the need for using written policies, whereas before we kind of had the policies were We were kind of laissez-faire with how we implemented policies or thought about policies, but the Safe School Study really advocated or really brought us to understand that we need to have written policies that we can look at, we can refer back to. Now, the National School Resource Network and further legislation picked up kind of the baton and published a set of guidelines for the development of those written policies, procedures, or practices. You can also refer to them as codes of conduct. At that time, the earlier perceptions of discipline policies were largely to provide a positive way of providing clear guidelines for behavior that would likely result in consistent and equitable applications of rules or expectations for all students, with the hope of making schools better. However, with the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994, and after a series of shooting and deaths in United States schools, those policies, or the theory behind those policies of wanting to be preventative, safe, wanting to be a positive way of keeping students safe, the Gun-Free Schools Act shifted educators' mindsets. The shooting and the deaths in schools shifted educators' mindsets, into which they begin to think about having more punitive policies. So the Gun-Free School Act mandated an adoption of zero tolerance weapons policies. This was to reduce weapons on campus, again, as a result of shootings and violence and deaths on campus. The idea was to reduce the school violence on campus and at school-sponsored events. But what happened from this is that states then began to broaden the federal guidelines for zero tolerance policies to not just weapons, but now it was for other things that school staff and faculty and just educators in general did not want to see happening on campus, such as fighting, the use of drugs or alcohol, the possession of narcotics, gang activity, so on and so forth. And so we moved from the zero tolerance weapons policy to, that's where we get zero tolerance policies for any other behaviors that were arbitrary or behaviors that were considered to disrupt the school environment. Overall, these zero tolerance policies or exclusionary policies were very harmful. We're still seeing the effects of those or these policies now as they continue to be implemented in our schools. One of those negative effects is the overrepresentation of our students of color, or our non-white students, our indigenous students, and students with disabilities who typically are receiving high rates of exclusionary practices for minor behaviors or behaviors that are arbitrary, behaviors that are perceived to be quote unquote inappropriate behaviors based on someone else's opinion of what is appropriate or inappropriate or not. So we're seeing again that zero tolerance policies are being used as a catch-all. These particular groups of students are receiving high rates of exclusionary practices for those types of behaviors unrelated to, again, the original intent of weapons or drug use on campus. Also, research has found that these policies, zero tolerance policies specifically, are theoretically unsound, they're empirically unsupported, and they fall prey to several legal critiques. So the US Department of Ed has attempted, beginning with the Obama administration, has began to start looking a little bit deeper into the disparities that are caused by exclusionary practices. So the Department of Ed and the Department of in the Office of Civil Rights that has the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey that goes out every year. What happens is the school reports their discipline data to their district, who then reports that data to the state, who then reports that data to the federal government. And every year the federal government reports or provides analyzes the data and provides the civil rights data collection survey results. So at any point in time, you can Google civil rights data collection survey and look up for the year that you want. The data are, so when they're published, it's published, for instance, you see here, the release for this particular one was 2016, but the data that they're looking at or reviewing are always 2 years before that date, so the 2013-2014 school year. In addition to these civil rights data collection surveys, where it is they begin forcing schools and districts to look at the disparities in discipline data and other disparities, the Obama administrator came out with Dear Colleague letters about the use of exclusionary practices and discipline disparities. In particular, in the 2014 Dear Colleague letter, it explicitly stated that states, districts should remove zero tolerance policies and exclusionary policies. They should implement multi-tiered behavioral frameworks, such as PBIS. They should manage discipline equitably and implement, again, frameworks such as PBIS and restorative practices. The National Technical Assistance Center for PBIS has a work group. There's a PBIS work group, and in the 2018-2019 school year, this work group, and you see the participants to the side, the individuals on the work group, my colleagues, developed a 5-point intervention approach for enhancing equity in school discipline. And within that 5-point approach, there are different guidance documents that I'm sure that you have had access to throughout this presentation, throughout this forum, but you can find them all here. In particular, the one that pertains most to our topic today and to policies that we're talking, the policies and practices that we're talking about, is the key elements of policies to address discipline disproportionality, a guide for district and school teams. Now, just because it says addressing discipline disproportionality, it's really a good practice guide for any schools who are looking to prevent disproportionality and really just looking to check their policies to make sure that they are non-discriminatory. So the federal government came up with or provided guidance through the form of civil rights data collection surveys. They provided the guidance through the Dear Colleague letters. They provided other guidance documents for redefining discipline. And so I conducted a study with a couple of my colleagues to see if schools were actually taking this guidance and changing their policies. So this is where the connection between PBIS and policy kind of come into play, where we say often in our practices that we are using the PBIS framework or we're using a multi-tiered system of support framework. And in practice, it looks like we are, right? We have expectations on the wall. We're giving students high rates of positive specific feedback. We are praising students. Students can get buddy bucks and pride points and whatever fun thing that we call them. And then when we get to our school code of conduct or our discipline matrix, I wanted to know how does PBIS show up in our written policies, or does PBIS show up in our written policies? How much of what we're saying that we're implementing in practice is actually done in our written policies. And so I did a study. We coded 147 policies across the state, or I'm sorry, across the nation, across the US. And we based our checklist, our way of coding, on these key elements of policies to address discipline disproportionality, as well as other guidance documents and other checklists. And we developed 7 domains of elements and elements for effective discipline policies. There were, these are the 7 domains that we largely put our questions under, our checklist under, and this is with the guidance document as well. And this is what we call CAPP. So again, like this element 4 here is one of the elements out of that guidance document that I just showed you, the clear objective discipline procedures. And then we ask questions underneath those guiding questions. So if you have clear objective discipline procedures, does the policy or procedure provide clear delineations between major and minor behavior incidents? Are problem behaviors operationally defined? Are rights and responsibilities for adults and students defined? So these are just the type of questions that we asked when we looked through each of the policies, and we put a check mark if they were there, and then we left it blank if it was not there. And there's a copy of the CAPP in your resources file. This is just another example of more questions that we have here under graduated discipline systems. Our systematic review showed we had good data, we had data that we'd like to see, and then we had data where we found some areas of improvement. For instance, our question 22 was, does the policy provide practices for reinforcing pro-social and expected behaviors as you would want to see, right? As our guidance has kind of directed or encouraged us. And what we found was that 87% of the policies that we reviewed did not have practices for reinforcing pro-social and expected behaviors written in the policy. Question 22 was, is zero tolerance automatic suspension mentioned as a practice strategy in the district? About 76% of the policies reviewed did still have zero tolerance mentioned in the policy. So that's just 2 of the questions out of the 42 that we had. But again, you feel free to use that CAPP and assess your own district codes of conduct. So we also asked what common themes exist in district discipline policies across those 50 states and the District of Columbia. Overall, we found the percentage of items that were in place that we gave check marks to barely exceeded 50%. The maximum percent of each item or an item in place for each element range from about 50% in place to 100% in place. And then the average percent of items in place for each individual item range from about 0.6% to about 60%. And then finally, we also asked, what is the relationship between the themes found in those district discipline policies and then the risk ratio for ISS in-school suspension, OSS out of school suspension, and expulsion for students of color with and without disabilities? Now, our findings, I will 100% say this out loud, that our findings were not statistically significant, yet we did find small correlations. So what we did find was that the higher that the score was on the checklist was correlated with a decreased risk ratio for exclusionary discipline for students without disabilities. And we also found that the higher scores on the checklist were correlated with the decreased risk ratios for exclusionary practices or exclusionary discipline for students with disabilities who identified as Hispanic, African American, and Native American. So what we found was that there's small correlations that if some of these checklist items were in place, there was a reduced risk ratio for our groups who are in the majority of individuals who are more likely to receive ISS, OSS, and expulsion. Here are some non-examples of the policy statements that we found. In some policy statements, we found that some students were suspended from school, will receive up to a maximum of 50% credit for all makeup work completed for the time they were suspended from that school. And so that was actually written in, these are, I pulled them exactly from the policy as written. Another one's missing an assignment or an assigned detention or misbehaving during a detention will result in referral to the office for a disciplinary action, and subsequent offenses will include in or out of school suspension. So you can see how some of our policy statements, we definitely need to go back and review and try to figure out the intent and what we actually want our students to do. For this first bullet, it always surprises me that this was in there, because inherent in what I'm reading is telling me that if a student is suspended from school, they're only able to, for the work that they turn in, they're only able to receive up to 50% credit. And when I think about the school to prison pipeline and how and these opportunity gaps or the access to instruction that we see for our students of color compared to their white peers, this one particular policy statement really speaks to the outcomes for those students. It directly relates to, or it can directly relate to, excuse me, academic achievement, dropout, and further engagement in the law enforcement and so throughout that school to prison pipeline. Also, the third bullet we see here is that many policies continue to use suspension for truancy and attendance. And again, so this is just something that we need to think about. Like if students are getting suspended or we're assigning suspension, they're obviously doing the behavior, and if it's happening over and over, they're probably getting what they want, which is to be suspended. So if they're late and you give them suspension again, that's just giving them what they want again. So some of these policies just don't really make sense, and so it'd be helpful to use that checklist to think about your policies and revising those policies. Here, many of these policy recommendations are in that guidebook for addressing and preventing disproportionality in policies, and they're also in the checklist, defining the pro-social behaviors, what you want the students to do, define the undesired behaviors, use a graduated discipline policy. So again, you can review these policy recommendations and use the checklist to assist you in revising your policies. Just a couple more, or three more that actually come straight from that guidance document for reducing disproportionality, including a specific commitment to equity and an equity statement, install effective practices. It's directly written in your policies, and then to create accountability for those efforts. And we can't just have these policies written, but we need to make sure that they are actually followed throughout the district and within our schools. So I will now move over and allow Susan and Holly to present their data on Highline Public Schools and talk to you all about the wonderful work that they're doing there and the changes that they have made to their policies.
Thank you, Amber. And I believe you're going to advance slides for me when I say slide. Is that okay? Thank you so much. And thank you for setting the stage with the research and what your findings are. And hello, everybody. I am Susan Enfield. I am the superintendent for Highline Public Schools. We are located just south of Seattle, Washington. So actually, when you land at SeaTac International Airport, our district surrounds the airport. So that gives you a sense of sort of where we are geographically. And I'm joined today by our Chief Policy and Strategy Officer, Holly Ferguson. She is all things policy. She is our policy guru. And Holly and I worked together prior to Highline when we were both in Seattle Public Schools. So we have been working together and getting up to good trouble for well over a decade now. And so I'm going to begin by giving you just sort of setting the context for who we are in Highline and how we started this work. And we really want to present this as a story and as a journey, because this work is not for the faint of heart. It is not easy, and it does not happen overnight. And so I am currently in my 10th year as superintendent in Highline, and we are still very much a work in progress when it comes to putting the conditions in place for this work to really be successful. So I will begin where we always begin, which is with our Highline Promise. So just to give you some context, when I arrived in Highline in 2012, the leadership team was reading a book by Dr. Yvette Jackson called The Pedagogy of Confidence. And it's a wonderful book. And the gist of it is, what if we treated every child as gifted? And I had always had the belief, as a former high school teacher and then later administrator, that it was my job to know every student by name and need. But when I got to Highline, reading that book challenged me, and we came up with our Highline Promise. And that promise is to know every student by name, strength, and need, so they graduate prepared for the future they choose. And to Amar's point about having a very clear equity statement, this is very, very much our clear stake in the ground when it comes to equity. Because I would argue that if we did know every student by name, strength, and need, and prepared them for a future they chose for themselves by not pushing them out of school for small infractions, by denying them opportunities through a lack of belief in what they're capable of, we wouldn't be having conversations about how to create equitable school systems anymore. We would have arrived. So rather than a mission or vision, in Highline we have this promise, and this promise really has become the DNA of our system. Slide. So in our strategic plan, which is based on the promise, we also lay out our foundation. And it was important for us when we went about developing our strategic plan, when I first arrived in 2012-13, that we used language that our families, our students, our community would understand, and it would be clear, not real jargony. What is it that we're about in Highline? Well, the foundation of everything we do here, and to deliver on that promise, is around equity, instruction, relationships, and support. And I would argue that this is the foundation of every bit of work we do, whether it is around curriculum and instruction, whether it is around facilities, whatever it is. These are the four things we come back to, particularly equity. And equity is really going to be the theme that we're going to come back to over the course of our conversation. And as I said, we do encourage you to ask questions, and we'll actually pause a couple of times for questions if Ambra has them from the chat, and happy to respond. But I would say, I do need to say that when I arrived in Highline, the district was already implementing PBIS, had been for a number of years, and Highline was one of the first, if not the first district in Washington State to implement an equity policy. So they had an equity policy on the books 2 years before I arrived. We've since revised that equity policy about 7 times, because it should be a living, breathing document, and it should get better as we get smarter in this work and learn from our mistakes. So we'll really sort of hone on the equity and relationships piece, because at the end of the day, that's what our work around supportive and progressive discipline is all about. Slide. All right, so let's just give you a little snapshot of who we are in Highline. We are a richly diverse school system. Our students speak well over 100 different languages, and our top languages are Spanish, Vietnamese, and Somali. So when I say diverse, I mean diverse. And as you can see, we do, though, the richness of the diversity of our student body is not necessarily represented in the diversity of our staff. Though we have made some significant improvements over the years there, this is still very much something that we are focused on. So our staff who have been hired within the last 5 years are significantly more diverse than our overall staff, because we've made a commitment, knowing what the research says, and frankly, knowing what our students tell us, that they need and want and deserve to see staff members who represent them as well. And so this continues to be an area of focus for us. Slide. As I said, richly diverse, many different languages, over 100, and you'll see what the top ones are here. We also believe in student first language. So we talk about our students who rely on us for their meals. So our rather than say our free and reduced lunch students, I'll say that, roughly 70% of our students rely on us for their meals. I also think too, that when we talk about discipline under any circumstance, it really comes down to fundamentally respect and relationships. And I think I think how we talk to, with, and about our children matters mightily. And Holly and I will reflect over the next 45 minutes or so on how much words matter, and how language is so critically important in this work, and how you can get sideways really quickly if you're not paying attention to that. So slide. So I'm going to give you a quick timeline, and then Holly is going to take over and talk to you a little bit about our policy work. But I just wanted to give you sort of tee this up about how we got to where we are today. As I said, I'm a former high school teacher, and in my 7 years of teaching high school, I never suspended a student. Now, I spent plenty of time before school, after school, lunch, having conversations with students who had made bad choices. But I believed as a teacher that we shouldn't discard a student for making a mistake, or for frankly, just being what they are, which is a child or teenager finding their way in the world and making mistakes along the way. I feel as the adults, we need to be the adults. And that means we have to turn tough moments into teachable moments. So I came with that sort of belief system myself. And when I arrived in Highline, and we'll show you some of the data coming up, we were, and I use this word very deliberately, we were hemorrhaging students to out of school suspensions and expulsions over 2,200 times the year before I arrived. And not coincidentally, our graduation rate was abysmally low at about 62%. And so I arrived and I thought, we have a problem here. We're pushing kids out of school and denying them the opportunity to earn a diploma for what was the most common infraction, defiance. And as I've always said, show me a teenager who's not defiant and I'll show you a walking miracle. That is what they are put on the earth to do. They are put on the earth to be defiant, to push the boundaries, and to, like I said, find their way in the world and figure it out by making mistakes. And it's our job as the adults to be the adults. So I come in, and we're in the process of developing a new strategic plan. And I was in a meeting with principals, and I just threw out one day, I said, well, what if we work to eliminate out of school suspensions? What if we just said we're just not going to do it unless it's critical for staff and student safety? Because here's the first lesson learned, and one thing that I would emphasize: when we take on this work, let's be realistic, let's be honest. And so to say that you will never, ever exclude a student from school is disingenuous, and it's false. The reality is, sadly, things happen. And there are some instances, whereas by state law, for example, if a student brings a weapon to school, that is out of our hands. That student is excluded, for the year. That's nothing we can do that about. And if a student is a danger to themselves or someone else, we do need to do something, right? Not permanently, but at least for the time being. So I think it's important that we are very precise in how we talk about that. But defiance is certainly not a reason to send a child home for a few days or longer. And so I threw it out there and let people just sort of wrestle with it. And then midway through my first year of the 12-13 school year, as we were developing our strategic plan, and this is listening to our students and their families and their experiences, that is the most powerful data that we can ever use to move our systems forward in pursuit of equity. And so I brought in two young men, both young men of color, to speak to all of our principals and central office leadership team. And Holly, I don't know if you were here for this one. It might have I think it just preceded you. And so, and they had both been out of school suspended multiple times during their time in Highline. And so they shared their stories, and then our leaders asked them questions. And I just sat and I listened. And I listened for the one question that I knew mattered more than any of the others. And when we got to the end and no one had asked the question, I did. And the question to these young men was, at any point during this period of time, did any adult in your school take the time to ask you what was going on? Why are you angry? Why are you sad? What is happening in your life that is leading you to make these choices? And I don't think you'll surprised to learn that both of them answered, no, nobody ever did that. We were punishing the behavior without diagnosing the root of the challenge of what was going on. So our large planning team for our strategic plan decided that, yes, we were going to take on eliminating out of school suspensions, except when critical for staff and student safety. And that we began in 2013. We implemented in sort of an alternative to suspension, in-school suspension, so that students who had committed some kind of an infraction, rather than sending them home, where it is highly unlikely that they reflect on the error of their ways and come back a completely changed human being, that we would keep them in school, get them the counseling they needed, and also hopefully help them stay on track. And we piloted a sort of an in-school suspension dean, if you will, re-engagement specialist person to sort of oversee that. And it was with mixed results, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's sort of the timeline about how we launched this work. But we knew, and this is where I'm going to turn it to Holly, that in order to really change practice at scale, you have to establish policy. Policy is how we codify our beliefs and priorities in a school system, and it's how the work outlasts all of us as individuals, because we come and go, but these policies remain. And so Holly's going to talk a little bit about our discipline policies and our PBIS policies, and then we'll share some of the data with you and also some of the other lessons that we've learned over the last several years. So Holly, I'll turn it to you.
All right, absolutely. I'd love to hear professors and superintendents talk about the importance of policy, because I feel like it's job security for people like me. So I appreciate that. And Amber, I really wish I had had these resources when I was starting out writing this policy in 2013. Would have been really helpful. So please know that I will be taking this for our next iteration. We really had three things that went into policy. We had our discipline policy, which is required by the state of Washington. Most districts are pretty much the same based on state laws and rules. We also had a discipline matrix, and I want to talk about that in the context of zero tolerance, the zero tolerance slides that Amber talked about. And then we created a PBIS policy that came a little bit later. So when I got to Highline in October of 2013, we had the very standard, Amber, you would have looked at these and said, okay, these are standard traditional discipline policies. And the matrix, the discipline matrix that we had basically was literally a grid that said, if a student is in this grade and does this thing, this is what will happen to them. And so you didn't have to think about it. A sixth grader who gets into a fight, it gets a 2-day suspension. And it, in some ways, was extremely calming to administrators and teachers and other adults in the space, because they didn't have to get into the messiness like Susan talked about what's going on. How come this fight happened? Can we talk about this? They could just say, well, here it is. So when I started in 2013 and we had this new goal, the first thing we did was to say, let's pull together a cross-departmental interdisciplinary group of people to get together and talk about what our beliefs are around this goal, and how does our policy match or not match that, and how does our data match or not match that. And I do want to say we did include our teachers union leadership in that team, which I think was important for getting buy-in to the policy itself. And we looked at the data, and we looked at the disproportionality, and we looked at the fact that the more subjective things had high disproportionality. Disrespect was one that just was off the charts disproportionate for lots and lots of reasons, I think. And we said, okay, you know what? This matrix needs to go. And in fact, I was able to point out that Washington state law actually requires schools to take individual circumstances into account. The matrix, I would argue, is in complete contradiction and violation of Washington state law, because it doesn't allow a principal to say, oh, that is happening to you. Now I understand, and let's take a different approach. So we threw out the matrix, and I got some earfuls on that from people who did not think that that was really what was going to happen if we said no suspensions, that we were really going to mean no suspensions and take away the matrix. And we revised the policy, but we realized that our discipline policy, and Amber, I'm reflecting back to your comment about the policies need to include pro-social behaviors and expected behaviors. Our discipline policy was just that. It was a discipline policy. It said the things you couldn't do, and said if you do these things, you're going to get punished. And let's also point out that discipline has a different roots than punishment does, but that may be a different presentation. We said, well, if we're really a PBIS district, and if we really want to have PBIS be our focus, why don't we have a PBIS policy? Why don't we have something that actually puts that out, where the board has put its stamp on it to say, yep, PBIS, that's what we do. So we created a PBIS policy. It's the only one that I know of in Washington State, although I admit that I haven't looked at all 295 districts in Washington State. And the goal of that policy is to really, again, enshrine, put the board stamp on it, that we want school to be a place where students want to be. We want to make sure that we have family engagement. We want to make sure that we have strong tier 1, 2, and 3 infrastructures. All those good things that that come from PBIS. Both of these policies and procedures were updated, have been updated twice since the 2013 school year, or the 13-14 school year, sorry. And the state has also done a bunch of work around discipline. But I think, Susan, do you want to talk about some of the data before we go into what the state did?
So if we could move the slide forward, Ambra.
Oh yeah, I think I forgot to do that, sorry.
Yeah, so that's okay. So Holly, is there anything you want to speak to on this one, or did you already go over this?
No, I think I went over that.
Okay.
You can see all the updating that we did.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yes, we've been busy. Next slide. And you talked about our PBIS policy. And by the way, these are all on our website, and you can also contact us if you need us to send. We're happy to share them. Holly, I want you to, on the next slide, you can advance one more, Amber. Thank you. Holly, I want you to talk a little bit too, if you want to kick us off on this one, around how creative people got around categorizing things, because when we said language matters, it does. And after we walk through some of this, some of the behavior data, I'm going to sort of tell you a story about some of the lessons that we learned. And I'm going to have Holly kick us off by explaining refusal to cooperate and disruptive conduct, unsafe activity.
Yeah, this was so fascinating. My undergraduate degree is in journalism, and I truly believe that words matter. And so we, as you can see, in the 12-13 school year, we had a lot of, and please note, this data includes all sorts of write-ups, for lack of a better word, that a student might get. So in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, the whole gamut. You can see how many refusal to cooperate infractions we had in 12-13. And please also know, the reason why it's 2018, 2019 data as the comparison is obviously the 19-20 and the 2021 school years were greatly disrupted by COVID, and discipline went out the window, which was great, but not actually reality. So in the 13-14 year, when we were doing our policy update, we said, whoa, ho, ho, what the heck is refusal to cooperate? And what is this disproportionality doing? And oh my goodness. And so we got rid of it. We said, you can't discipline students for refusal to cooperate anymore. Guess what? That became disruptive conduct or unsafe activity. It flipped. I mean, you could look at that. You can see those numbers there, almost on a dime, to become a different name for basically the same thing. The other one that we saw, which isn't on here because it doesn't happen very often, was interference with authority. And that became the new term for disrespect. I used to suspend students for disrespect. Now I'm suspending you for interfering with authority. We got rid of that one, or we redefined interference with authority, interference with authority in the 2019-2020 school year, to basically say interference with authority means literally physically interfering with a teacher or principal's ability to do something. And unfortunately, we don't have that data here now to look at the change, because again, the last 2 school years got so disrupted that we just don't have that. But now that we're back in school again full time, I'm going to be very interested to track that change, to see what interference with authority becomes in version 3.0.
And Amber, you can go to the next slide. Thank you, Holly. But to Holly's point, I think it's worth sort of pausing here for a minute and just explaining that one of the big, well, we learned, there's 2 big takeaways that I would say. When we took this discipline transformation work on in 2012, 2013, not many people, absent having OCR come in and tell them they had to do it, not many districts were voluntarily really looking at their discipline data and practices and revamping them. So we were really out front. And when you're out front, you take the hits. And we took a lot of hits for taking this work on. So when I say this isn't work for the faint of heart, I mean it. But there are two big things that I want to share in terms of lessons learned. Number one of the things, and I will take responsibility for this, but I think I can say we, because I know Holly would agree too. You can change policy and you can work to change practice. And we were working on that. But changing culture takes a lot of time and trust. And coming in as a brand new crazy superintendent with all of these bold ideas who didn't have the relationships and the trust yet, and underestimating how deeply seated the culture was in Highline, where I would argue, and I don't say this in any way to denigrate those who came before me, but it was a very adult-centered culture. The adults were doing what they knew how to do and were confident in doing and were comfortable in doing. And I will be honest, our children were paying the price. And so, so the culture was, a student does something to annoy me, I can just get rid of them. Well, now all of a sudden, the superintendent, the district is saying, whoa, time out. No, you don't just get to get rid of them. You've got to actually work with them, build that relationship, have the conversation, and get to the root of what's going on. It doesn't mean no consequences. It doesn't mean keeping a student who is truly a danger to themselves or others at school without some kind of, extra support. But you have to do that work. That was a huge culture shift. And to say that the pushback was significant is an understatement. But I wish going back, I had paid more attention to that. The other thing that I really learned, so we adopted the strategic plan, and the board adopted it in August of 2013. And one of the goals was 0 out of school suspensions, except when critical for staff and student safety. Here's another tip for you. When you put something in small italicized print, people don't read it, or better yet, they choose to ignore it when they really want to come after you for what is said in the big bold print up above. So people, our critics just sort of, attached to 0 out of school suspensions. And, I had families and staff members saying, you're telling teachers and principals they cannot suspend. And no, that's not what we've said at all. But we are saying we are not going to send the message to our children that we will just, throw them away when they make a mistake out of the gate. We're just not going to do that anymore. But over time, we learned a couple of things. Number one, and Holly will speak about this later, we had principals who, wanting to do what the district was saying was a priority, were just maybe sending kids home without calling it a suspension. And I had to have numerous in-person conversations with our, leaders saying, look, I don't want fake data. This isn't about artificially lowering our numbers to look good. I have no interest in that. And you'll see in the coming slides, which we'll get to, I'm going to stay on this one for a minute, but as we go through it over the next few minutes, you'll see that the data is mixed. It goes up and down. This is not linear, consistent improvement, unfortunately. So
Susan, can I jump in and add something real quick about that? I can't tell you how many conversations that I had with principals, assistant principals, teachers who were basically afraid they were going to get fired if their discipline data, quote unquote, looked bad. And I would sit down with people and I would say, do you know anyone who's been fired because of their discipline data? Well, no. Do you know anyone who's been reprimanded for bad data? Well, no. Why do you think it's going to happen to you? Well, I don't know. I'm just really worried.
Yeah.
Okay. And we are still spending time, it's not gone, telling people your data is your data and we want to work with you on it. But if you don't show me the real data, I don't see where you need support and I can't help you. And I also can't praise you.
Well said. So, and the other key lesson that I will share is when it came time in 2017-18 for us to do version 2.0 of our strategic plan, I had this epiphany because we went out and we talked with staff, like what has worked in our strategic plan work to date? What hasn't? What do we need to do differently, change? And all of a sudden this light bulb went off in my head and I realized 0 out of school suspensions and expulsions was never the goal. That's just a metric. The goal is to create schools where adults and students alike thrive, where they feel respected, challenged, supported, included. And so we changed our goal to being about school culture with out of school suspensions and expulsions as the metric. And that was another thing that I wished, I had been smarter about at the beginning, because I think that would have probably shifted how some of those in our community who were critical of this work would, had seen it. So how they hired new teach. Okay, so I'll get to the hiring question in a second, but I'm gonna go over this slide, and then Ember, there's just a bunch of data slides that I'm just gonna have you maybe every minute or so just go through as I keep talking, and I'm not gonna speak everybody to. You can read data slides on your own. So the data, it just sort of illustrates some of what we're talking about. We want to keep sort of sharing the lessons learned in the story, but I will just start here. We've made progress. We made some progress. We're not happy with the amount of progress we've made. We'd like to be more. We'd like to see it more, especially for our Black and African American students. While our disproportionality has gone down, it hasn't gone down nearly enough. So I am unapologetic in naming that, owning that, and saying that we are committed to addressing it. And I will say this: it is easy. I am a very impatient person when it comes to this work, and when you are leading systemic culture change like this, you have to acknowledge progress, because if people don't feel that the progress counts, they're going to feel beaten down, ticked off, and they're going to give up. And you need to keep people engaged. And so acknowledging the progress is important, but we still have plenty of work that we need to do. So Umber, I'm going to keep talking, and you can just sort of keep clicking through these slides so that people can see them. I'm going to actually answer the question around teacher hiring and relate it to one of the other challenges that we had when this happened. So at the end of my second year, Holly, I believe this was the year you were here. So in the 13-14 school year, that was when we had the mass exodus of teachers. I believe, wasn't that the year? Am I right on that one? Yep.
Yeah.
So one of them, one high school, actually, a majority of the staff signed a Dear Highline letter that they sent to me explaining why they loved Highline but had to leave because it was unsafe and they just couldn't do it anymore, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and as you would imagine, that was painted in the press as, it's anarchy in the schools. Highline is just letting, they're not disciplining, they're not holding children accountable, it's chaos, et cetera, to the point where the Seattle Times actually did a 4-page front page story the week before our school bond measure was on the ballot, about how teachers were leaving in droves and how the discipline policies that we had put in place were driving good staff out, et cetera, et cetera. So we lost some staff over this. And when I say this is not work for the faint of heart, you have to be okay with that. And you have to publicly be okay with that. And one of the things that we've gotten better about in Highline is to be very clear on what it means to teach here. Our policies are bold. Our stance on equity is bold. And this may not be the place for you. And just because you teach, just because you lead, does not mean you can do that in Highline. You have to work to show up each day and be the kind of educator leader that our children deserve, and they deserve the best. So we did have staff turnover in my first several years. And it's now plateaued. We went from about a high of about 15% of staff leaving sort of in the early few years I was here. Consistently over the last 2 years, we've been at about 8.5%. So it's really plateaued. But what we've done is we've gotten clearer in what we're about, in how we hire. We've invested heavily in recruitment and retention. We are listening particularly to our newer staff who are more diverse. So our staff of color, what do they need in order to be successful in this school system and stay? Because we, most importantly, our students need them to stay. And so we support our staff being in affinity groups that we compensate them for. We have regular listening sessions with staff. Any staff member who reaches out to me and wants a meeting gets it. And so we really try to hear what our staff is saying. And quite frankly, I will also say that the boldness of the work that we've done has attracted a lot of the people that our kids need and deserve. So we're getting people actively choosing to come to Highline because of the stances that we have taken. And so I think it's very important as school districts that we are clear about our values, about what we stand for and what we will not stand for, so that we get the right kids in our community, and not treat rather our educational staff in our districts as interchangeable widgets. They're not. Teaching in Highline is very different than teaching in, say, Mercer Island or Bellevue, which are two districts in another geographical region in our geographical region, in our region. That was not articulate, but that have very different makeup in the community, different challenges, different priorities. One isn't good, one isn't bad. They're different. And I think they require a different skill set in the people. So we've just gotten very clear. We've also developed a teacher profile. So we're clear on sort of what we're looking for in our teachers. So if the person who asked that question, you're welcome to email me and I can connect you with someone on our HR team if you'd like more information on that. And I will also say we've gotten smarter at hiring. Our interview teams, which especially for principals, consist of family members, in some cases students, staff, et cetera. Our interview teams go through implicit bias training before they go into those interviews. So we are continuing to get better at how we bring people into the system so that they can sustain themselves and do this work. Because as you will see, this work is up and down. And I think we also have to be honest too, that I'll be very candid. I will be shocked if we don't see an uptick this year in some behaviors. We can't deny the fact that the pandemic has impacted every one of us, and that we have children and adults alike out there who are hurting, who are struggling, and that will manifest itself likely in behaviors at school. And I think our staff are already seeing it. So sort of focusing on how we are, so I would say not to focus on discipline, but to focus on relationships, to focus on what are we doing to hire, retain, and support the staff who are able to build the relationships with students and their families, so that when discipline incidents happen, they can be handled in a way that isn't punitive, that isn't exclusionary, unless by law or by circumstance, and that's rare, that it has to be that way. That needs to be the last resort. So there's another question, Holly, about struggling with the requirement to align behavioral definitions, PBIS, with the district code of conduct.
Yeah.
Upper administration not willing to approach. Well, I don't have to read you the question, Holly. You can read it. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that question really resonated with me. That is a definite struggle. I don't know where the questioner is located in this country. Now with virtual conferences, we can be anywhere. We struggle with that in Washington State. Washington State lists things in their I guess it's sort of the state code of conduct. The list of things that a student can be long-term suspended for in Washington State basically comes straight out of the criminal code. It is, in fact, literally references the criminal code instead of the educational code in Washington State law. And so it does include things like kidnapping, rape, sexual assault. And we have not resolved the conflict that that language is in conflict with the PBIS language and expectations. We have occasionally had to have hard conversations with people. Assault is one that people wanted to remove from the list of possible offenses that students could be disciplined for, and had to sit down and have some hard conversations about, actually, we have some students who have assaulted other students. They've injured them badly enough that they've landed in the hospital. That is an assault, and we need to be able to name it as such. Again, to the point of having good data be good data. So I would advise the questioner to look at your state laws and rules and see if there's anything in there that is actually stopping you from being able to pull those things out of your code of conduct. And I would also say, and Ambra, you and I talked about this a little bit in one of our pre-meetings. We have a law in Washington State, and it is unfortunately a law, so the legislature would have to vote to change it, that allows a teacher to remove a student from their classroom for the remainder of the day and up to 2 additional days for disrupting the classroom. And then that up to 2 additional days gets reduced when the principal has a conference with the teacher about the student. But we have a state law that says a teacher, not a principal, not a school administrator, can take a student out of school for 2.5 days, just off the top, for anything that is, sorry, I had to write down the actual phrase, a disruption of the educational process. And that is not defined. So when we think about subjective things that students are excluded from school or class for, that you can drive a truck through that one. And so, like I said, look at your laws and rules in your state to see if those may be things that you just have your hands tied on. And if you do, what we've basically done is we've kind of pushed all that. We have, let me phrase it a different way. We have really emphasized the PBIS stuff and kind of said in little type, and you can also be long-term suspended for these kinds of things. But really try to de-emphasize those.
And an extension of that, I think, Holly, is the next question. Then we'll talk about what we've learned. So please keep your questions coming. The question around training. So we have early on and consistently, we have provided de-escalation training for all of our staff. We've we also annually hold our equity symposium, which all staff attend, which we've tackled topics like implicit bias and other things, so that we're examining our own beliefs and beliefs that come out in our practices. So, you know, it's, and to the question around whether parents have input, we actually have a family action committee. It's a group of parents, family members, representative of many of our schools, and I meet with them at least quarterly. And Holly has come and we have shared with them over the last few years iterations of our policies, and they weigh in on those policies and procedures and share with us what their experience has been. So yes, training has been ongoing, and we have definitely and intentionally reached out to parents and families to hear from them what they need to see, and whether the policies and procedures that we have developed make sense to them and are not going to have unintended consequences. Because when you're leading for equity, when you're working towards equity, you have to be clear on what the unintended consequences or impacts may potentially be. And I think Holly and I have shared what some of those were as we launched our, you know, our discipline transformation work here, but that has to be seen across sort of all aspects of the system. So I'm going to, and Holly, just jump in as we sort of go through this list, because I know that we're coming up on 2:15 and I'm hoping folks have more questions. Like I said, words, what?
Susan, I want to ask a question, a follow-up question to that for the to that question.
Yeah.
So specifically, has there been any training for the teachers or for the admin on the difference between what is a minor behavior or minor offense versus the major offense? How are they able to differentiate between those two?
Yeah, Holly, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, we have not, you know, you sit in seminars like this one and you think of, oh man, there's a whole bunch of things we should have done differently.
Yep.
I would say that we have not done as good of a job on that as we could have in retrospect. I think it's been a lot left up to the schools to do that sort of training. And so we kind of put out here's the big buckets of what discipline looks like, and here's some other tools and things like that. And we have schools that have chosen to really vary their practices. We have some schools where it's very tight. We have some schools that write everything down and file everything with the office because they want to make sure they have a record of it. And we've had some very long discussions. So I would say, no, we haven't done enough. And I don't think that we've been systemic enough in what we've done, leaving a lot of it up to the schools.
I would agree with that. And I will add that, you know, when I was a student teacher, my mentor, Nick Ferrantino, is a wonderful man. You know, he said to me, because I took over the journalism program from him, and he said, you know, Susan, train them and trust them. And I think it's important that we hire well and then trust our staff to do their jobs. And I believe that the caliber of principals that we have in our system, and that the quality of teachers and paraeducators that we have, you know, they are working together as a school community to really understand the difference between major and minor. And I think that it is a fine line. Yes, I agree with Holly. we can and should do more, I think, in terms of being explicit around training. And I think at some point we have to trust these professionals to make good professional judgments. The system, the district, cannot come in and make decisions that a principal, assistant principal, teacher really should be making because they're closest to the situation. And ideally, they have a relationship with the student in question, right? That they are more suited to have that conversation. And so I think that that's really important. So I think it's a balance between district-driven training and support and trusting the professional judgment of the professionals that you're hiring to do the work. So Holly, I'm going to go through this. Please jump in on any of them. I think we've talked about words matter. Choose your language very, very carefully and intentionally. And I think Holly, I love that this just screams Holly Ferguson on it, but if suspension is the only tool it's the only tool you'll use. And I think that phrase really talks about that attention to culture that we didn't have moving forward. Teachers and staff, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were doing what the system had set them up to do. And so I just think as systems leaders, we need to be mindful of systemic changes we make and the impact that has on individuals. Sort of the absolute seamless integration of PBIS and social emotional learning infused in everything that we do, students and staff alike. Teaching and reteaching applies to adults as well as students. This is not check the box work. This work is iterative, it's ongoing. As I say, we make progress and then we backslide. Life is messy, life happens. Sadly, in Highline, we have all of the challenges that urban school districts have. A lot goes down in our communities that impacts our students and our schools, and we have to attend to that. So constantly coming back to remind ourselves of not just the what we're doing, but the why. I think I talked about having really clear, our Highline Promise, our clear line in the sand around who we are, what we stand for. And frankly, Holly and I have pushed back pretty significantly on the state, whether it's our state superintendent, the governor, our state board, when they're coming down with discipline rules that just fly in the face of doing what's right for kids. And I'm sure Holly, Holly, I don't know if you want to give an example of the most recent changes they made, and maybe one of the things that we said to them at the end about what this just doesn't work in practice for children.
Sure. So the most recent changes from the state say that you can't out of school suspend a student before trying some other intervention first, which in concept is absolutely 100% spot on. We asked the state what to do when a student shows up at school high, because it happens. Mm-hmm. And we said, well, what intervention are you contemplating that we should try when a student comes onto school, drunk, high, etc. And they said to me, and they actually said it to a room full of school lawyers, so that was maybe a mistake on their part. They said, well, that doesn't really happen. And we said, have you been to a school? It happens. And they couldn't give me an alternative for what we would do in the interim. So what we ended up doing was we basically codified what schools were already doing, which is student comes on high, you pull them aside, you talk to them about what's going on, you find out what's happening, and then you send them home safely, please, safely. And that counts as a one-day suspension, and they can come back once they're no longer high. But it's just sometimes the disconnect between what the state says and what's our reality on the ground is very different.
And so you have to be willing to speak up and push back if needed. And I think as Holly said at the end of the day, and then I'll get to the next sort of question that's come up, it takes a village, right? So as school district staff, we have to partner with families to be a unified team supporting our students. And so engaging our families in this work has been critical. Engaging our students in this work as well has been critical. I'm sure like many of you in other districts, I also have a student leadership team that I meet with, and we've brought our policies and procedures and practices to them as well for input. So making it be an ongoing conversation, making sure that your policies and procedures are living, breathing things that are responsive to our evolving learning. We are learning organizations, friends, and as such, we should be learning and applying what we learn to the work that we do. I think, you know, one of my favorite, you know, quotes is was it Maya Angelou? Once you know better, do better. You know, we should be getting smarter and doing better as a result. So there is a question, and I'm not exactly clear in the way that it's phrased, but it sounds like there's a recognized need to revise a code of conduct, but the superintendent is reluctant to get there to do that until there's more diverse committees and there's no movement being made. Okay, so I'm going to try to address this. I apologize to our colleague who put that in there if I don't get it right. I'll say a couple of high level things. Number one, you know, this really does have to start with the superintendent and school board. And I want to be clear, no superintendent can be any bolder than their board will allow or support. We were fortunate in Highline that our board was supportive of this work and deeply committed to not just talking equity, but walking equity, and recognize that this was a part of that. So, and clearly I have a little less fear than the average bear, right? I'm willing to take on some fights in a way. And part of that, I just want to be clear too, is our local political environment. We can take on these issues here. We can have some of these hard conversations because we're in the progressive, quotes, Pacific Northwest here. Other parts of the country, the politics are very different. So I think you have to pay attention to what the board and superintendent's willingness to take this on is, what the local politics will support in terms of this. And then really, I think there are ways to do a stealth campaign. When I'm going to say use, it doesn't feel like the right word, but I'm going to say it just for lack of time to, use your families and kids, get their voices in there. The board and the superintendent can't ignore that. They can't ignore it when families and kids start telling their stories about how a code of conduct is negatively impacting them. And then don't reinvent the wheel. Look to other districts around the country that are doing this. Beg, borrow, adapt policies and procedures from other districts. You don't have to reinvent these. We borrow and adapt all the time. That's the nature of this work. So I think I would say go to the students and families who are living the impact of the code of conduct of the policy, and let those voices be heard, and let that drive the change and the development of the committee to do that work. And with that, I think we are at 2:13. So Holly and I will just thank you for being here today, for participating. Please don't hesitate to follow up with us if we can be of any more help. Amber, we'll turn it back to you. Thank you for including us today.
Thank you, Holly and Susan. I really appreciate you all being clearly, I think everyone is able to tell why you all were asked to be my exemplar. So I am very happy. Thank you. You all are so busy. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate it. And with that, everyone, you have on your screen, and you will be receiving an email to complete the session's evaluation. You can scan the QR code there or find it in the chat. We thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.